Today we're going to be testing out the Anycubic Kobra 3 combo to see if its unique features make it one of the best multicolor printers on the market right now. First things first, let's get this printer out of the box. This machine was very kindly sent over by Anycubic for me to test out, but you know how I run things on this channel. I never hold back from criticism, and I always just want to showcase what these machines are capable of creating. The Kobra 3 is a bedslinger style printer, but despite that, it is actually packaged in one piece. The only separate parts are the ones in this tray that sit on top of the AMS unit. Because it is in like mostly one piece though, it did make it a bit interesting to unbox it. You can see me struggling here a bit with this giant massive printer technology, but it's all good. In the end, I did manage to get it out of the box. The first main piece in this foam bundle is the Anycubic Color Engine, aka Ace Pro, aka the AMS unit. The rest is literally just the whole printer. While I'm getting all of the packaging removed, let's talk about some of the specs for this printer. The Kobra 3 has a build volume of 250 by 250 by 260 millimeters. It has automatic bed leveling, automatic Z offset, filament runout and tangle detection, and can be paired with the Ace Pro for multicolor printing. It's advertised to be compatible with 2 AMS units to print up to 8 colors, but right now there doesn't seem to be any further info on that. The Ace Pro has some really awesome additional features on its own though. Thanks to its enclosed design, it also doubles as a filament dryer that can be running continuously during printing. Even though the main frame of this machine is already assembled, there are still a couple of parts that we need to install on the machine before we can get it printing, starting with the hot end assembly. In the bag of fun that's provided, we're going to search out the baggie that is labeled for printhead. This is awesome to see these bags labeled, as well as in the instructions it actually shows what size hex key you need to be using for the individual part that you're going to be installing. I turned the printer around to its back so that we can better see where these screws need to go, although they are also visually marked where the bolts actually need to go to attach the printhead, and there are 4 of them, which you're going to want to make sure are very securely installed. Next up is the screen, which again there was a very obviously labeled bag for touchscreen hardware. When I was installing these 2 bolts, I didn't actually realize that the touchscreen could be tilted upwards and downwards, so I kind of made it harder for myself, but after you have the bolts installed, then you plug in the ribbon cable, and you can see here the tilt adjustment that the screen has. Next was this PTFE tube clip, I guess we will call it. It's a bit more of a unique piece, and this just slots onto the side here. Next up was the purge wiper. Now, this was a bit interesting because the bag that had the bolts in it had 2 different ones when the instruction only said you needed 1, so I'm not sure if the other was extra, but I used the one that seemed like it was the appropriate size as listed in the instructions and installed that. Next up were the cables, which there's actually only 2 that need to be plugged in here. They're both kind of connected though, and they have this rigid area which makes sense to be slotted into this section like so that it doesn't move around, but I found that it was like an inch or 2 too tight if you try and put it there, and just in general it seems to like unplugging itself from that connector piece when you're printing with this machine. The last bit of assembly is mostly just setting up and connecting the Ace Pro unit. Inside the Ace Pro is where you will find the PTFE tubes as well as some instructions as to how to connect this appropriately. Mostly you just want to make sure that you're connecting the appropriate end of this one cable between the Ace Pro and the printer itself. You'll find the connection point on the printer underneath the USB slot on the front of the machine, which I have to say is not the most ideal location for this. And the other parts that need to be connected are the PTFE tubes, which the ones that they give you are extremely long, so they can be quite unruly to feed through, and I'm not sure if this was the most ideal way to be doing it, with connecting it to the hot end first and then feeding them through this side clip organizer situation. It technically doesn't matter which tube goes in what slot. It's mostly just for organization reasons that you probably want to have these as inline as possible. You also don't want these to accidentally be too tight when you start moving around the print head. After that, it's just installing the PTFE tubes onto the back of the Ace Pro unit, which I actually don't have footage of because it came with these clips installed, which make it absolutely impossible to insert the tubes into, so you need to remove them before you have any chance of actually inserting the tubes properly. And after that, the only thing left is installing the power cord on the Ace Pro as well as the the printer itself. And once I had it all together, I just wanted to really show you how long these PDF tubes are compared to the rest of the whole machine setup. I don't really want to complain because I would much rather these be too long and you trim them than them be too short to begin with. But after that, you can power the printer on and continue on with the fairly typical 3D printer setup. First up, it's going to do a self-test and home all the axes before going straight into bed leveling. Well, first it heats up the nozzle and bed so that it can clean the nozzle and just generally have a more accurate bed leveling experience, with the bed being at a closer temperature to what you'll be printing at. And this is all sped up, by the way. I figured we didn't need to sit here for the 15 minutes that this probably took in real time. Next up is the vibration compensation. This is when it never looks like on camera the machine is doing anything, but it is vibrating at different frequencies to hopefully minimize any possible artifacts that might show up on the printer. It always sounds absolutely insane when it's doing this though. And after that, setup is complete. It did immediately prompt me to update the firmware, so I did that before getting the first print running. I decided to start off with some machine quality of life prints first. Because this printer does have the multicolor capabilities, I figured it was probably necessary to have some sort of waste collection bin as well as a deflector. So I decided to lean into the orange color theme further and loaded up some orange PLA to get these two parts printed in. First was the deflector piece, which this printed out really clean. Very impressed with the quality of this print. I could one hand snap the tree supports right off of it and get it installed on the side of the machine. I just clicked onto the wiper blade assembly. Speaking of the wiper blade, the Kobra 3 uses a magnet to engage the blade and wiping action, which is pretty unique. It's also this like full metal piece, so it does seem like this probably will hold up over time very well. The blade itself is quite a distance away from the nozzle though. I know the blade doesn't have to necessarily be like touching the underneath of the nozzle to still be effective, but there is a chance that the distance could possibly cause some blobs and artifacts on the prints if it isn't doing an effective enough job because of that distance. And here's what the finished purge basket turned out like. Again, a very nice, clean, and smooth looking print. Obviously not the most complex shape ever designed, but sometimes it's the simple things where you can really start to see the problems with printers. But now let's actually get into some multicolor prints. But we need to talk about this slicer. When I started filming this video, the only slicer that was available for Mac was the original Anycubic slicer. It is still the top one listed on their website, and I can confidently say, do not use this slicer if you're going to be doing multicolor prints. You can't even input 3MF files, which is what the majority of multicolor print files are. So there is now the Anycubic slicer next, which I swear this tab was not here when I was originally testing out this printer, because I had to go to the Anycubic wiki to go down to the Kobra 3 combo and look at the slicer software available, which is here is where you can see the Orca version of Anycubic slicer, which is what the Anycubic slicer next is only available for Windows, which is a massive problem for me. So there was like a workaround for actually using Orca, which is what I will do eventually in this video. But yeah, I just needed to explain what was going on because the slicer situation was a mess when I was filming this. So in the OG Anycubic slicer, I recolored this very clearly Halloween decor item that my mother coerced me into printing for her. I figured it would be an interesting test though, and it was one of the few things that I was willing to recolor on my own in this original slicer. With it being a flat design, the waste also isn't terrible, and I didn't actually even bother to use a purge tower on this. And here's how it turned out. You can see the waste. It is still some waste, but it's not the worst by far that I've seen. There was a bit of under extrusion on some of the upper layers, but overall it's a pretty decent looking print in my opinion. My mom was very happy with it, and the bottom or first layer also looked like it printed really clean. So let's move on to something a bit more complex. So next I'll be printing this BD1 card model, which this is using Orca slicer since the Orca version of Anycubic's new slicer did not exist for Mac yet, and the old one wouldn't open 3MF files. So as long as I flipped the settings to be the Kobra 3 and moved things around so that it fit on the bed better, we were all good. But then I had the wonderful task of trying to get this on the machine. I am so used to just sending prints over Wi-Fi that it didn't even occur to me to put it on a USB stick first, and so my workaround was putting the G-code into my iCloud drive and then uploading it using the phone app, because that was literally the only way to do it. You can't even select files from the cloud on the printer itself, so you literally are forced to use the app. And this is also the point when I noticed, looking at this footage back, that when I set this print to start printing, it had basically no print color information, especially when you look at what happened when I used the Anycubic slicer. You select the file, it brings up the 4 colors that it was set to use. I can remap it from the app, but the Orca G-code didn't have any of this information or option available at all. So that meant that I absolutely needed to put these filament spools into the machine exactly as they were listed in the slicer to make sure that this model would actually print how I wanted it to. You know, have the specific colors that I wanted to be the specific areas to actually be those colors. But the good news is after all of that drama, this actually printed really, really nicely. There was a bit of color bleeding between the red and the silk silver in particular. This red filament, though, is absolutely the most staining filament I have ever encountered, so it is possibly just that it was a bad combination of that specific red along with the silk, and obviously increasing the purge volume between those 2 filament colors would possibly eliminate the color bleed as well. Here is what the waste was looking like. I did weigh this so that we had an accurate assessment of exactly how much this would be, and it ended up coming out to $1.56, which is, as you can see, based on a $20 per kilogram roll, and that was from 189 filament changes according to the slicer. This is such a cute and impressive multicolor print though, even with that slight color bleed, which I would not blame on the printer. That is absolutely on me for not calculating those purge settings or decreasing the purge multiplier more than I should have, especially between those 2 particular colors. Because other than that, I think this turned out to be a pretty clean and awesome looking print. I wanted to try multicolor printing something even more 3-dimensional though, so I decided to recolor this small cheap dome, and this print I actually decided to cancel. I noticed a few hours in that the colors were just not turning out very good in certain areas, and it was wasting filament like crazy, which this is not a type of print that I would typically do. I kind of go all out for these videos to realistically show you what these types of multicolor prints produce in terms of waste. And so because I added the black lines into the recessed panel areas, it was having to change the filament color 3 times every single layer. So even at this canceled point, it had already produced a ton of waste, and it was just going to kill me to continue this print job. I wasn't entirely sure if it was Orca that had produced the bad quality print. It would be highly unlike it, but in the name of testing, I decided to take the exact same print file and just print it in the single color, and this turned out really clean. So obviously it was the color swapping in the small areas that I was trying to force the machine to do that it didn't like, because there were some panel areas that looked really, really clean and impressive, but then you would turn the dome around and all of a sudden there would just be a blobby mess. After that slight dilemma, I decided to revert back to a flatter multicolor print, which is honestly the type of print that I generally gravitate towards. They're a really great balance between the multicolor functionality and what this technology can do without being overkill on the waste. So this was the Armorer coaster that I decided to print, and thanks to this slightly textured bed, the layer lines on the bottom are pretty invisible, so this ended up being quite an impressive piece. And also hardly anything for the waste, to the point that I didn't even weigh this. I wanted to go back to a more complex multicolor print to see if I could get better results, and I decided on another droid dome because that just went so well the first time. For this one though, I decided to stick to 2 colors, so at the very least it would be less purge waste if it wasn't turning out the best. I also very specifically wanted to use a couple of these Anycubic spools. These are part of the Pantone color set, and as you can see, the cardboard spool is a bit damaged and a little misshapen, so I wanted to see if this would actually work in the machine. There are always the prints for an outer ring that you can print to put on the cardboard spools if they are giving your AMS difficulties. But for these, I kind of just wanted to see what happened, and because these were the Anycubic spools, they also have the RFID tags, and so I wanted to see how that would also work on this printer. This time around, I put the print file on the USB stick, and this actually brought up some color remapping options, which is interesting because this was also sliced using Orca. So obviously, if it's on a USB stick, stick on the machine, the remapping option is there. If it's on the app, it's not at the moment, but the RFID system did work. It did recognize that the purple and blue colors were installed in their particular slots, and then it was off to printing. This one I did have complete because it was looking a whole lot better than the cheap dome. The one thing that I did notice is the timing for this print was way off. I believe it's possibly due to Orca not being able to calculate the exact time that's needed to change the filament colors, but the machine never updates this timing on its own. So once it hit past this half-hour point, which there was no way this print was finishing in 27 minutes, it just zeroed out and I had no concept of an estimate as to when this print might be done. Now this next part I am going to chalk down to somewhere between user error and freak accident. I honestly wasn't sure what I was seeing when I first walked into my workshop and saw this spaghetti situation, but it was apparently due to the purge tower being knocked over at some point during the night. Thankfully, this mostly didn't affect the print other than this R2 dome having a little bit of a mohawk situation going on there for a second, but I mostly could remove all of the excess filament that was just sort of hanging off of the back, and other than this one little line that for some reason was affected, but the rest of the print looked really clean. Even though I did down this dome to only 2 colors, the waste was still quite intense given that it basically had to do a filament change every single layer of this dome. So you're looking at about 250 to 300 filament changes, and that was with 2 colors that were quite close, so pretty minimal in terms of like excess purge. It's not like the filament was having to purge the amounts that would be needed for something like going from white to black. So this one had no visible color bleed and also no areas that I would say looked particularly blobby or anything. Other than that one line in the slight spaghetti catastrophe, this turned out to be a pretty great print. Definitely the redemption that this printer needed. As always, I wanted to wrap this review up by sitting down and giving you all my final thoughts on the Kobra 3 combo. You can probably already tell from the rest of this video that this one was a bit of a mixed bag. There are a lot of things that I really like about this 3D printer, but there are also a lot of things that I found very frustrating and unnecessary about the user experience. So I guess let's start off with the positives. Overall, I found the print quality to be really great on this machine. Other than that one multicolor cheap dome that had those random blobs on it and just did not look like a great multicolor print, there were no complaints from me in terms of the quality. The overhangs on the different pieces printed really clean, and all of the other multicolor prints that I did seem to have turned out great. Again, it's one of those things that this is why I always insert close-ups of the prints, because what I might think looks like a good print might not be good enough for some other people. Another massive positive about this printer is the AMS. I know a lot of people would find the AMS being enclosed and also a built-in filament dryer to be incredibly useful. It is one of those things that I am very lucky that I live somewhere where humidity and moisture affecting the material is not a big concern for me, but I know for a lot of people that is almost one of their biggest and main concerns. So the AMS unit also being a filament dryer that can be drying the filament when it's printing and not having any concerns in terms of moisture is incredible. The only really downside that comes along with it being a filament dryer is that it has its own power cord. It needs to be plugged in separately, and you also need to turn it on separately from the 3D printer. Some people might find it annoying that the filament dryer does not automatically turn on when you set something to print on the machine. Again, as somebody that is just not a massive diehard filament dryer user, that's not a massive deal for me, but I can also understand where those people are coming from, especially if it is a standard for you that when you are having something printing that you always have it in a filament dryer and that dryer is running. It having the capabilities with something that's plugged into a machine and then it not automatically doing that does seem to be a bit of a miss. I suppose the most ideal solution for this is that there's like a button added or somewhere in the slicer where you can check off to have the filament dryer running for the duration of the print and already have all of those temperatures set and everything. So hopefully that is something that we see in future firmware and software updates. Another positive that is slightly related to the AMS and its multicolor printing capabilities is that it does actually change the filament quite fast. When I was timing it, it was averaging out to be about a minute minute and 10 seconds, which is definitely on the lower end in terms of filament change speed. I know initially I raised a concern about the space between the nozzle and the wiper blade, but there was nothing that I really noticed in terms of excess filament that wasn't getting wiped away as accurately as it should have been. So it does seem to be working quite well as is. And I also never had any issues with the magnet not appropriately engaging with the nozzle once it went over to the side to switch out the colors. It does make a very distinct noise though. When the hot end goes over, the magnet does clink against it, so it is something that you need to get used to, I guess. You know, I have had it been running on this desk, which is in my main workshop area, so I have been working in different parts and had this machine running, and eventually it just sort of becomes white noise that you don't pay attention to. But because the wiper blade does have that more unique magnetic feature, then it is a sound that is not going to be present on any other 3D printers. Another positive with this printer is that it involves very little assembly out of the box. It is the only bed slinger that I have personally used that comes in one piece already assembled. Most of the time you are attaching the upper frame of the printer to the base, but this one, probably because it has that AMS and there was just that space in the box, already comes pre-assembled. So it's very fast and easy from having the printer go from packaged away in the box to out on your desk and running. For the most part, I also really like the design and aesthetic of this printer. The orange touches are a nice pop of color that I then leaned into with some of the accessories that I printed, and really the only complaint that I have in terms of the design of this machine is the placement of the, I wouldn't even say the USB ports, it is more the AMS port. The USB ports being on the front because there is the chance that you are going to want to use a USB stick to put files on this machine makes sense, but then when it comes to the AMS and it being something that is continuously plugged in, having the cord being in the front and then having to somehow wrap that around the machine and to the back of the AMS, just not a great setup. I definitely wish that that was relocated to either the back of the machine or the side even. Quite literally just anywhere but where it is right now. Another slight downside in terms of the design and more specifically the AMS is, while it is a positive for a lot of people that it is an enclosed filament dryer, it also means that because of that design that it does take up quite a lot of desk space, as you can see what we've got going on here compared to me. I think a really interesting possible setup would be to have the AMS stationed underneath the 3D printer. It's not something that I personally have really looked into yet because I've just kept the printer running on this table for now, as I tend to do when I'm testing out new machines. But at the very least, if you had the AMS stationed underneath the 3D printer, then you would about have the desk space needed to house this. And that brings us to the biggest downside with this 3D printer, and that is the software. You saw me constantly butting heads with it throughout this video, and it honestly just sucks because this 3D printer is great, it has a ton of potential, and it's just being so severely let down by the software side of things. Like, I cannot think of another time using a machine that I have had to jump through so many unnecessary loopholes. Now, I know some people might have an issue with me choosing to stick to my Mac and not going and getting my Windows computer and using the updated Orca version of Anycubic Slicer, but at this point, this is not a brand new 3D printer. I tried to find a specific release date for it, and the closest I could discern was that it came out in June at some point. So at this point, it is like a 4 to 6 month old printer. And to not have your flagship slicing software be available for all operating systems is honestly unacceptable at this point. Even within the time period of filming this video, Orca has updated and now the Kobra 3 combo is included as one of its default profiles. So it is even easier to use, but that still doesn't help the fact that from my research, apparently the Kobra 3 uses a customized version of Clipper, which is why the IP address is basically locked down to Anycubic's own slicer. So unless you're using their reskinned version of Orca or their phone app or Lord knows what else, you have no way of remotely sending prints from a slicer on a computer to this machine. Now, I don't know how easy that would be to remedy if it is a thing that they could just flip a switch on and then all of a sudden the IP addresses are unlocked and it could become compatible with Orca on its own so that you could remotely be sending 3D prints through that slicer. But as of recording this video right now, you can't. I truly do not understand the appeal or the necessity that these various brands see in reskinning Orca now is what everyone is doing. An unnecessary and completely avoidable avoidable problem to be having. Like, they're shooting themselves in the foot. Now, all of this being said, I would much rather a printer have software issues more than hardware issues, because software issues can be fixed a whole lot easier than hardware issues can. Another thing that I didn't actually realize until I was editing this video back is on the Anycubic Slicer app, when I sliced something with their own software, it fully showed the different filament colors that the print was supposed to use, and also gave me the option to remap the slots if they didn't match. But when I used Orca, it did not do that. It just like sent it off to print as honestly as if it was going to be one color, to the point that I wasn't even actually sure if it was going to multicolor print. I even tested this theory to see if it would remap if I skipped a slot. So for the cheap dome, I was only using 3 colors, and I knew in the slicer I had them listed at like 1, 2, and 3, but instead I had them in slot 1, 2, and 4 to see if it would remap or give me any sort of error when I went to go print it to say, hey, this slot is empty, which it did not. But even weirder is when this happened, it gave me a filament broken error on the machine. It said nothing about the fact that the slot was empty, so it was just a blind guess on my part that it's like, is this what's happening? And so I just moved the filament to the next slot and then hit resume, and everything was all good. But the printer didn't have like any specific error in terms of what that problem was. Like, the filament broken error is a very specific thing for the printer to be telling you is the issue. So I truly did not know if there legitimately was a filament piece broken somewhere on one of the colors, or if it was giving me the error for the empty filament slot. Those two issues are very different things, and this printer apparently just looped them all together and called it a day. So there does need to be some firmware upgrades for more specific error messages for this machine, so that people aren't left guessing what possible problems are, because I did actually have it accurately tell me what one of the issues was, and that was obviously when it had like pushed the filament back, it had somehow not looped around the spool correctly, and it was all just sort of a mess in the AMS. And I can't exactly remember what error the machine gave me for that, but it did accurately detect that there was an issue with the filament, that it wasn't properly being able to be fed through the PTFE tube. So the filament tangle sensor definitely works great on this machine. I'm not entirely sure if that was an inaccurate error message because of using Orca and it not being their native slicer software, which again, it shouldn't even be an issue, because this machine could very easily tell like, hey, there isn't any filament in the 3rd slot, so like reload the filament or something else that shouldn't be slicer specific. Yeah, very mixed bag with this one, which is really unfortunate, because I do think that this printer has a lot of potential and it is a really nice printer. It does print well, but because of all of these unnecessary software issues and all of these hoops I'm having to jump through every time I just want to slice and send something to this 3D printer, it just makes me not want to use it, or at least not use it over any of my other machines. So the good thing is, by the time you're watching this video at some point in the future, then all of these slicer issues and software things could be updated and completely fixed. And if that's the case, then this printer is probably working great for everyone now. But as it currently stands, between the slicer and software and all of the hoops I have to jump through to get this printer working how I want it to, then there's nothing specific about it that makes me want to use it over other machines that give me half of the headache. Overall, I think the Kobra 3 combo has a lot of great stuff going for it in terms of the hardware side of things, but for the slicer and software user experience, there needs to be some significant improvements and upgrades made. But that is everything, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.